Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today on the podcast, we have Martin Luther Chang, who is a professor of Hebrew and the acting director and assistant professor of Jewish studies at the University of Kentucky. Martin Luther Chang, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I'm happy to be here.
I should have said shalom manishma, but I think we both know that if we attempted to have this podcast be solely in Hebrew, one, I'd sound like an idiot, and two, most of our listeners would have no idea what we're talking about. But you do not fit the profile of what one would expect to be the stereotypical Hebrew person. You were born in Hong Kong. You were raised in America in both an English and Chinese bilingual household. And it wasn't until college that you really started studying Hebrew whatsoever. Can you sort of walk us through this journey? How did somebody born in Hong Kong, growing up in a Chinese speaking home, how did you end up being a professor of Hebrew?
So I should respond in Hebrew, Toda raba al hazmana. And so to start with my story, my parents are very, very religious Christians. And so growing up, we were reading the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible in English in translation. So from childhood, I really wanted to read the original language and understand it. And so when I started at UCLA in 2011, one of my priorities was to learn biblical Hebrew. And at the time, it just so happened that the biblical Hebrew class was filled. And so I wasn't able to get in. So then my dad just casually suggested, how about modern Hebrew? That's kind of close to biblical Hebrew, right? And so then I took modern Hebrew with Nancy Iser, who was the Hebrew professor at the time. And then it just completely changed my world. So I should tell you, of course, and the audience that it wasn't an easy process, right? Because Nancy taught us the whole alphabet in a day, in 50 minutes, because she had this assumption that we all knew Hebrew from Jewish school. And so I remember just being so overwhelmed. I cried and I thought, I'm going to drop this class. It's impossible. But then I stuck with it. And then I was really inspired by Nancy in particular to continue with my study of Hebrew. And then after finishing the first and second year with Nancy and Jonas Abar, who's the other professor of Hebrew who's now retired, I decided, oh, I don't know what to do with my life because I'm going to graduate. I'm a senior. And I was thinking, should I do law school? I'm not interested in law. And so just by a whim, I applied to graduate school in Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA. And this is just how one thing led to another. So basically, it started on taking modern Hebrew as a whim and then not knowing what to do and having this existential crisis after college and then going to graduate school, getting into graduate school, and then again, this is how I'm here today. So it's a lot of serendipity.
No, I love that. And just for listeners, you went to undergrad, got your master's and your PhD all at UCLA. We overlapped for many of those years. And I remember
Yes.
I also took many of Nancy Ezer's courses. She was the professor of Hebrew at UCLA. She sadly passed away a few years ago, but I remember sitting in a lot of those classes. I had to take all the intro level classes, even though I came in speaking a good amount of Hebrew. And I remember always feeling really bad for the people who didn't grow up going to Jewish school, because you're right, she would go through the entire alphabet in a day. So I can definitely sympathize with you sitting there thinking, what the heck is going on. You eventually, of course, stayed in grad school. You got a PhD. What was the topic of your dissertation?
The topic of my dissertation was actually about sociolinguistics of biblical Hebrew. It's because in graduate school our program is more focused on the ancient world and ancient Israel in particular. So while there was room to explore modern Hebrew, it really couldn't become the main focus of one's study because we just didn't have a program in modern Hebrew. So this is why I did a lot of biblical Hebrew, but my passion, of course, was primarily modern Hebrew and the overlap between the two. So of course, to anyone who's interested in studying Hebrew, I would say if you want to go to Israel and speak to people, learn modern Hebrew. But if you just want to read the Bible, you can just go directly to biblical Hebrew, and you can always go back and forth between the two if you're really interested in investing in this endeavor.
I
So
often
that
joke because
was my
most of
dissertation.
my Hebrew is coming from either the Tanakh slash the Bible, and also rabbinic works such as the Mishnah and others. I've never formally really learned modern Hebrew, and so a lot of times, apparently, I've been told by Israelis when I speak, I sort of sound like almost in English. If you've learned English through Shakespeare, you can get a point across, but you kind of sound like a fool. Doth thou want to come on the podcast as opposed to do you want? And so how for listeners who maybe know a little bit of Hebrew, maybe they speak Hebrew, maybe have read some of the Bible. What are the most salient differences between biblical Hebrew and modern Hebrew?
So of course, the first one is vocabulary, right? Because biblical Hebrew in total only has 8,000 unique words. And of those 8,000, only 1,000 appear only one time in the entire corpus.
This is my
And modern
favorite,
Hebrew,
my favorite academic word. The a word that only appears one time in the Tanakh. Just for listeners, it's a hapax legomena. I'm sure that
yes.
has some Greek meaning, but I can never refrain from saying a nice vocab word there.
Love that apex legomenon, and I was afraid of using it at first because I didn't want to make it too technical, right? But one of my favorite apex legomenon in biblical Hebrew is the word vina, which is cheese in modern Hebrew. That appears only once in biblical Hebrew. So for scholars of that language, before modern Hebrew was invented, they would struggle to think, oh, what's vina mean? Or what can this possibly signify? We have to rely on context to figure that out. But now in modern Hebrew, we just take it for granted. So again, it's like the amount of vocabulary in modern Hebrew is much greater, and the variety of vocabulary, right? And we have borrowings from Aramaic. We've Hebraicized a lot of words. We've taken words from Ladino, from Yiddish, and it's a very active and generative language. And
Mm.
that's the main difference. And then grammatically, I think modern Hebrew is slightly less complex than biblical Hebrew because there are fewer tenses in biblical Hebrew. They teach you all the like the subjunctive and gessive and all of that. In modern Hebrew, you just learn past, future, and present. You don't have to worry about all these things. So it's a little bit simplistic grammatically compared to biblical Hebrew. That being said, the process of learning it is much more difficult in modern Hebrew because you need to internalize all of that grammar. Versus in biblical Hebrew, it's sufficient to simply recognize the structures. And this is why I tell my students of biblical Hebrew, just recognize it. But if you want to speak in Israel, memorize and generate it.
Got it. No, it's really interesting. And it almost leads to, I think, one of the other things, and of course, you're the expert here, so you can correct me if I'm wrong. Biblical Hebrew evolved over a much longer time period than modern Hebrew. I mean, I want to get to modern Hebrew in a minute because it's a fascinating, just historical story of what happened there. But I mean, the Tanakh was written over the course of 6, 7, 800 years. I mean, these sort of, ancient poetic texts, say the Song of Devorah that appears in, that's oftentimes highlighted by scholars as one of the older works. I mean, that sounds just completely different than if you're reading, I mean, even a story in Genesis, which is completely different if you're maybe reading Ecclesiastes, one of the later works. And so, I mean, I don't even know, for teaching biblical Hebrew, I mean, I've sort of myself, and you're probably gonna, hate to hear this as somebody who tries to teach somebody a more systematic way. To me, I don't really know how I translate almost biblical Hebrew. And there are times where, I'll be learning with students and we'll be trying to translate, either Tanakh or Torah or Mishnah or something like that. And I say, I don't know what this literally means, but it generally means this. And they're like, what do you mean by that? And I'm like, I don't really know. It just, these three words just kind of generally means that. But for scholars that actually try to write systematic, one of the things, just to, again, paint for listeners, one of the things that both Jews and also Christians have been doing for really thousands of years is trying to write a dictionary or a systematic way of interpreting biblical Hebrew. Because, of course, if you're a religious believer and you believe that these texts have, infinite divine meaning, the precise translation of these texts is going to be of the utmost importance. And, okay, especially if a word only appears once, then it's a very difficult question. But even say, I actually had a student reach out a couple weeks ago, and he sent me a text and said, my friend is a Christian, and he just sent me an article about Isaiah chapter 7. And, about, and just for listeners, Isaiah chapter 7 has a verse in Hebrew that says the Alma, right? Alma being the Hebrew word, will conceive and have a child. Now, early Christian interpreters and exegetes interpreted the word Alma as a virgin, right? Leading to the virgin birth. And this is one of the big proof texts. Many Jewish scholars have interpreted Alma as, generic term for a young woman. So in terms of what's at stake here, right? Just to highlight this for background, I mean, this isn't just, okay, you might not get the full understanding of the poem. I mean, this can be the difference between, a Jewish worldview or a Christian worldview there. So how do you even begin to approach this in terms of trying to teach somebody, just the complexities of biblical Hebrew?
Oh, so first of all, I want to weigh in on that discussion point about Alma, and you're absolutely correct because it is translated in the Christian context as virgin. But if we look at the Hebrew Alma and we have Elam, which is the masculine version, and we look at Arabic, it all just means boy, or in the case of Alma, girl. So we know that it's just a generic way to refer to a person. And then in biblical Hebrew, also betula, which is used in modern Hebrew as well to mean virgin. So there is this contradistinction made. So it's absolutely not a virgin birth if we read it from the Jewish context and the linguistic lens. It is just a birth from a maiden. And so regarding your question about how do I teach biblical Hebrew systematically, so I focus primarily on grammar, first and foremost, especially in the first year. And the good thing about teaching in the university context is that we're very academically focused, right? So I try to avoid these thorny issues where I would basically undermine somebody's entire worldview with the interpretation of a single word, right? It's a very high stakes endeavor here. So we focus on grammar, and then now that's in the first year. In the second year, biblical Hebrew, I ask students to tell me the text that they want to read, and depending on the difficulty, we go through them together, but it's text focused, and then we learn the grammar relevant for understanding a text. So this is the way it's taught at the University of Kentucky. So again, grammar in the first year primarily, then in the second year it's text focused, with grammar being the supplement to understanding a text.
Got it. So you're not actually doing, because again, I'm no expert on learning languages, and the fact that I always say I've been trying to learn Hebrew for 30 years, and I speak passable Hebrew and can translate passably for the number of hours of my life I spent in a Hebrew class. From I went to day school from 0 to 12. I lived in Israel for a few years. I took 3 years of Hebrew at UCLA. I should be an expert. I should be able to, get up freely and speak, and it's still not great. There's oftentimes a heavy focus, and you also see this with language learning apps like Duolingo and things like that, just a focus on vocab words. What I'm hearing from you is there's very little focus on, ochel means eat and lashevet means to sit, right? It seems like that's very much a secondary concern for you.
But because, from my point of view, I know that the time with the students is limited. They have at the most 3, 4, maybe 5 hours a week with me in the classroom. So I need to be giving them something that they couldn't be acquiring on their own. And vocabulary, while important, and it's impossible to read or speak a language without the proper vocabulary, it is not something that they absolutely rely upon me to deliver to them. So it's something they can study on their own. And I tell the students as well, we're going to read authentic text, and we're going to read it with as little simplification and as little abridgment as possible. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide vocabulary translations for you as glosses on the side. But what you need to understand is the grammar, because you need to see how the words interact with each other and the syntax. So I'm less concerned when a student can't remember vocabulary, but I'm very concerned when a student can't remember grammar, especially in the biblical Hebrew context. In modern Hebrew, I would say there's equal emphasis on both. But let's focus on biblical Hebrew for now. I would say grammar first, then vocabulary second, because it can always be looked up. But of course, as you said, Daniel, there are these cases, right, where we have scholarly like mashluket or disputes about the translation of a word. Recently, we were reading Genesis chapter 6, when Noah sends out the Yonah, the pigeon slash dove. Then the Yonah comes back with an alay, or alay zait in its mouth. And that's commonly translated to as olive branch. And one of my students pointed out that olive branch has become such a universal term for peace based on that passage. But alay in Hebrew literally means leaf. So it doesn't have the same kind of imagery, right? When you say olive leaf versus olive branch, just because we've been so influenced by the translation.
This is probably why there hasn't actually been peace yet, because we're sort of confusing the biblical narrative there. Just to
Send an
just to
olive
take
leaf to somebody next time.
There we go. So just to take us back in history a little bit, the origins of Hebrew are a little bit murky. Obviously, some of the older biblical texts are maybe 10th century BCE. There were sort of some older stela, sort of these archaeological findings that were found maybe 11th or 12th century. But what do we know about the origins of biblical Hebrew? Where does it come from? How does that sort of develop from, ancient language until something that's recognizable as biblical Hebrew?
Okay, so basically, this is a scholarly quest to find the original language, right? Not just the original language of the Middle East or of the Jews, but the original language of all human beings, based on the story of Babel in Genesis 11. And unfortunately for us, scholars have yet to identify a single human language from which all human languages have emerged. But what they have done is that
Is
by
that even,
using the
sorry to
system,
cut you off? Is that still, I mean, I actually know very little about the history of language. Is that still the theory of most linguists, or, history of languages?
there is general consensus that genetically related languages may have descended from a common ancestor, but now there have these that they call this the branch um, model, right? So all languages as a branch of an original tree. But then now what's becoming more common is also a wave model. For instance, languages might have all interacted with each other at some point, so it becomes very difficult to disentangle which language could have arrived earlier, or what features are original to all Semitic languages or all European languages, for instance. But just for simplicity, because I don't want to like uh, burden the viewers and listeners with this kind of linguistic jargon. But I think if we assume that the branch model is the accurate model, then there's something what we call Proto-Afro-Asiatic. So linguists believe that around 15,000 years ago, and they're not sure where exactly. There's dispute about around this. Some people believe in the Horn of Africa. Some people say in what is modern day Saudi Arabia. There emerged a group of people who spoke something akin to um a language that would have sounded somewhat like Hebrew or Egyptian or Amharic, so that's all mixed together, right? And then they migrated throughout the Middle East and North Africa, and they, in particular in the Levant and the Fertile Crescent, this is what the Semitic heartland is. We have the emergence of a specific branch of Afro-Asiatic, and this dates to probably 3 or 4,000 BCE, and that's where what linguists call Proto-Semitic. So this is basically a subdivision of the Afro-Asiatic branch. And of course, there is no linguistic evidence for this language ever having existed as a reconstructed language. So what I always tell students, whenever we say proto, it means like we're imagining it existed. We're not sure. We're hoping there was one language that from which all Semitic languages emerged. We can't prove that definitively. But let's say for the sake um, of argument that it did exist as one a coherent language. Then at some point, the ancient Semites spread across the Middle East and the Levant region, and then they broke into different branches. So in the we have East and West in particular. So on the East side, we have Akkadian, and that language that was spoken in what is Mesopotamia or in modern day Iraq, and that has died completely now. Then in the West Semitic branch, we have Arabic, we have Hebrew, we have Aramaic, and these are the main Semitic languages that we're familiar with. So biblical Hebrew, as you said, Daniel, really accurately, we didn't really have any attestation of biblical Hebrew being written until like we discovered those archaeological stela or inscriptions that have a language akin to biblical Hebrew. And of course, it's another scholarly argument. Is this indeed biblical Hebrew? Was this another kind of Levantine Semitic language? Was this an unidentified language that we don't know anything about? But that's basically the shorthand version of where Hebrew came from.
Got it. And so if you hear some barking in the background, that's my puppy. She might be upset that she's not in on the conversation here.
He wants to learn Hebrew.
If yeah, exactly. She has to learn Hebrew here. Let me go open the door for her. See, I don't usually take the podcast on a journey here, but I think listeners have already been introduced to the puppy in previous podcasts here. But if they're interested, they can see her there, her smiling and barking there. So just to point us historically a little bit, and there, okay, she ran outside. She gets very excited. My apartment, as those who have visited before, is on a golf course here, so she always sees the people playing golf in the background and gets very upset that she's not invited into the game. Okay, so if we took a time machine back to First Temple period, and just for listeners, reminder, this is roughly 920 BCE to 586 BCE. The average person in, say, Jerusalem, are they speaking a recognizable form that somebody who is able to interpret the Torah, would they be able to participate in normal conversation? Or would that language just be so different, it would, there would be no chance?
So traditionally, the answer would have been yes. And I think that's there's good linguistic evidence for this, and there's also a lot of ideology surrounding this, right? We want to, those who study Hebrew want to present Hebrew as this coherent language that has existed throughout human history, and it has continuity to this day. So where a modern Israeli could speak to Moshe Rabbeinu, for instance. I like to, of course, playing the devil's advocate, and based on my own research in my dissertation, I believe that biblical Hebrew was subject to something called diglossia, meaning that there was a written language that was standardized in the king's court. So in the monarchical period under David's descendants who ruled in Jerusalem, they standardized the language, and the language became frozen. So just imagine if the way we write English today, and we continue to write it in very formal English, abstaining from using contractions, abstaining from slang words, and they preserve this kind of pristine form of biblical Hebrew. But then language cannot be dictated or policed, right? So individuals who, especially they don't have contact with each other, they speak differently, and different ways of speaking emerge. So the argument could be that while the language that was written would be understandable to a modern Israeli today, or to somebody who interprets biblical Hebrew, the spoken language may not necessarily have aligned with what we have in reading. And this is
Mm.
the case of something we see in Arabic, for instance. For instance, if you study Quranic Arabic, then you could say, oh, an Arab from Egypt today, or from Palestine, or Syria, or Lebanon, could just speak to Muhammad the Prophet. But it's not so simple because Arabic has different dialects that are diverged tremendously from what Muhammad would have spoken.
Is this even
And
the
so a
difference
similar
between
situation could
more?
exist for Hebrew.
I mean, I'm thinking, if you ever try to read, you try to give somebody a dense academic article or even, a dense legal article, there's a reason why we have to hire lawyers to read everything because the sort of jargon of official writing is so different, if me and you are grabbing, a cup of coffee, I might say, yo, what's up, Matan, just for listeners, your Hebrew name is Matan. So I would say, yo, what's up, Matan? How have you been? Obviously nobody would ever write that, right? You would say, to whom it may concern, whatever, the jargon.
Absolutely.
Is that kind of the difference, when, our only real recording of, okay, we have obviously, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong on the historic record, but if we're still talking about ancient Israel, okay, we have the Tanakh, which is probably the main source of biblical Hebrew. Then we also have these sort of random letters that are being sent around. So there was a Jewish community that was living down in Egypt and some early Jews, living out in Babylonia. And so, there were some famous, letters going back and forth, but those are very similar, for what I understand, to biblical Hebrew. But we don't have, somebody writing, hey, what's up? It's Daniel. This is my diary, day 57. It's really hot today in Jerusalem, right? So we don't actually know how the day to day would have been spoken.
Right. And also think about the context of writing, as you mentioned, besides a few letters, which are somewhat informal in nature, we have narratives in biblical Hebrew, and those are prepared, those are dictated, those have been polished and refined. So even for that day, imagine you prepare an essay, Daniel, you're not going to write exactly colloquially in your essay, and you're going to refine it to a nicer level of language that's more suitable for the context. So I would say that even in a language like English, where we don't have this clear case of diglossia of where the spoken language doesn't quite align with the written language, we still have differences, right? And so I would argue the differences were greater in a language like Biblical Hebrew, which is very uniform, which is surprisingly uniform, actually, given the fact that it was written for hundreds of years
Hmm.
and with minimal changes in the standard form. Of course, like you mentioned, there's this archaic biblical Hebrew, there's this late biblical Hebrew, but what scholars refer to as this as standard biblical Hebrew, meaning this kind of middle register of biblical Hebrew that existed probably from the, let's say, the 9th century to the 6th century. That's 400 years of linguistic uniformity that doesn't align with what we know about human language. So we
Got
could
it.
say that, as King David spoke, there's no way Hezekiah would have spoken the same way,
And this is just the
even if they
same
wrote the
way. I
same
mean,
way.
even when I meet now freshmen in college, just the no, just I mean, just the lingo, right? I mean, even both of us, I mean, we're not that old, right? And even for us, it's like, what do all these things mean? What does it mean?
Slang, man.
Exactly. So, I have no idea what skippity means, but I have been seeing it.
Yeah,
I have been seeing it with increased context. So I can only imagine, the
right.
ancient is.
And that's 15 years, maybe it's 15 years since we've been in college, not even 15 years, right? And the language has evolved so quickly. So not only 300 years. So even if they're writing in the same way, it's quite unlikely they're speaking the exact same way that they were writing.
100%. Okay, so at some point in ancient Israel during biblical times, spoken language shifted away from Hebrew to Aramaic. If both Hebrew and Aramaic had existed in ancient Israel in some ancient form, why the switch? Why at some point, presumably everybody would have been reading, ancient biblical stories in Hebrew and still learning Hebrew to, conduct, say, the priestly service that was in the temple. Why the switch to Aramaic? Do we sort of know historically?
So actually, if we look at, I believe it's Second Kings 22. You can fact check me. This is when Sennacherib, or we say in English, Sennacherib, um, besieged Jerusalem. Hezekiah's messengers asked him to speak in Aramaic and not in Hebrew because he was telling them that, oh, we understand Aramaic, but the people don't understand Aramaic because we want to conceal the message that's being spoken. And Sennacherib was, of course, delivering a message of destruction and threats to the people of Judah at the time. So this is around 700 BCE. The Hebrew and Aramaic were quite distinct at this point, where they're not mutually intelligible, and most Jews or people of Judah, I should say, were not able to understand Aramaic. And what happened was after the Babylonian exile in 587 BCE, the Jews were transplanted to Babylon. And we see in Daniel 1, all the youth without blemish, the ones who were handsome, the ones who were suitable for cultivation, were re-educated in Aramaic, which was the prestige language of the time, which kind of like the French or the English, what we call the lingua franca, like the common language of the Middle East. And this is when the Jews started to make the transition to Aramaic. And this is where we see in biblical Hebrew, we have this slow but inexorable march toward increased Aramaic influence in the language. So we have increased loan words, for instance, deen, meaning, as you know, religion, that comes from Aramaic. We have a lot of words, igeret in biblical Hebrew, which is a missive, or even the word metulgam, like a translation or translated, that comes from Aramaic. So again, we see this increased Aramaic influence on biblical Hebrew starting in exilic times, and after the Jews came back to Zion with Nehemiah and Ezra, they had switched primarily to Aramaic as a means of speaking. And I think there's a mention in the Tanakh that Ezra not only had to read the scrolls to the people, you also have to translate a little bit for them, because at this point they had become adapted to speaking Aramaic. And of course, this takes shape, especially during the time of the New Testament or during the Roman times, and people say Jesus spoke Aramaic for that reason. And then, of course, as you know, in the Mishnah, in the Gemara, they're all written in Aramaic or in this hybrid of Hebrew Aramaic. So it really started during the exilic period and took form in the centuries afterwards.
Yeah, and this is of course another difficulty for people who want to translate the Tanakh, is that, as you go later, say, of course the book of Daniel, but even say the book of Esther, which is pretty simple Hebrew for most of it, every once in a while you'll get slapped with a word that you're like, what the heck does this mean? And it might be Aramaic, it also might be Greek. There's a lot of Greek words that are sort of snuck in there, which again, I think is probably, again, I'm saying this as somebody who's never studied linguistics, but I can just imagine, I mean, even the same way that, Yiddish words have entered into the American mainstream. I mean, everybody sort of knows what the word schlep means. And that
Yes.
sort of entered English. So I imagine there were some Greek words or some, other words that just kind of entered into biblical Hebrew or biblical Aramaic, and everybody kind of just went with, okay, pardes, right, which appears in the Tanakh, right? Pardes is obviously from the Greek paradise. I don't think they purposely stuck in a Greek word. It was probably just everybody knew, pardes, paradise orchard there.
Right. And one of my favorite examples, Daniel, which actually from the book of your namesake, Daniel, in chapter 4, I believe, is where Nebuchadnezzar he erects a statue, and he says that once the music starts playing, he lists the different instruments that will be playing. One of them is psanter, which doesn't sound Hebrew at all, because you have that ps from Greek, the P and S, and that's in modern Hebrew has become a piano. Another instrument though is symphonia, which is where we get our modern English symphony. So again, we see this like with Greek words snuck into biblical Hebrew, and I just find that fascinating when reading that. So here we see symphonia in biblical Hebrew, or biblical Aramaic, I should say.
Got it. Interesting. Yeah, and I think it also, I mean, again, there's oftentimes a debate. I mean, I've sort of seen this, historically, no one really debates this anymore, but like which languages are more pure and which languages are not as pure. Yiddish is oftentimes held up as the paradigmatic example of a non-pure language. I mean, Yiddish is sort of the, smorgasbord, I'll use another Yiddish word, right? The sort of, mix of all the other languages concocted together, and, sort of it arose bottom up, and, all this. But to some perspective, every language, there's no sort of pure ideal type language that doesn't have loan words. Is that
Right.
correct?
Absolutely. And I think there are some languages nowadays that have really pushed back against English influence, because English is now, the dominant language of the world. So in Germany, like they're trying to avoid what we call Denglish or Deutsch English. And in France, they have this whole academy that tries to restrict the number of English words that can enter the language. But all of these artificial attempts to suppress language evolution have never been successful, because languages evolve and then they adapt words from other languages when people come into contact with each other, especially in this globalized society. And to a lesser extent, while the ancient Near East was not as globalized as we are today, Jews had interactions with the Arameans and the Persians and the Greeks. And so inevitably there are going to be words borrowed into Hebrew. For instance, words like Zman. Zman, I always thought this was a Semitic word. Turns out it was borrowed from Persian.
Hmm.
which is Zaman in Persian. So again, all of these words that, just surprise you, they become Hebraicized and you take them for granted as a part of the Hebrew language, and you discover no, they're brought from another language. Because the
No, it's
Hebrew
really
word
interesting.
origin for time was et, as we know from Ecclesiastes.
Wow. No, I never even thought about Zaman and Et, and the shift there, Zaman also meaning time, just for listeners that have never heard that word. Okay, so then for about 2,000 years, right? I'm going to generalize historically for a minute. I'm sure if I ever said this in any of my Jewish history classes, I'd be mad at myself. But for about 2,000 years, from, let's just give an easy year, zero to the 1900s, very few, if not zero, Jews spoke Hebrew, right? There would have been, especially among the more literate Jews, the Jewish prayer services were conducted in Hebrew. Many rabbinic works, commentaries on the Torah, many, some of the Talmud, some of the Midrash, of course, most of the Mishnah was written in sort of this clunky rabbinic Hebrew. There were times of revival, right? So medieval Spain is oftentimes held up as an example of, there was a bit of a revival of Hebrew poetry. This was probably medieval Jewish Spanish poets trying to say that Hebrew could compete with Arabic for what was considered the most beautiful language. So okay, you get all this fascinating, most of our Zmirot, right, are the religious songs that people sing today. Most of that was written actually by Spanish poets trying to prove that Hebrew was a beautiful language. But still, even if you were in elite Jewish circles in the 12th century in Spain, nobody is introducing themselves to a friend on the street or on a podcast in Hebrew. And it's not until modern Zionism and really this figure Eliezer ben Yehuda, where modern Hebrew starts to take off. I'm going to ask you about Ben Yehuda in 1 second, but before we do that, I just want to tell my sort of favorite story about Ben Yehuda, but paint a little bit of the background. We've discussed Zionism a lot on the podcast, so I'm not really going to go into the ideological roots of that, but the first generation of political Zionists, and when I say that, I mean, Theodor Herzl and his ilk, were very against any type of Hebrew being the official language of Israel. Herzl actually has a famous essay where he derides early attempts at reviving Hebrew by saying, what a colossal waste of time. Can we imagine that there's ever going to be a day when somebody's going to order a train ticket in Hebrew? As if to say, like, this is crazy, right? How the heck can you even begin to describe a train in Hebrew, right? This is an ancient language that, has sort of been pocketed away. Eliezer ben Yehuda, more affiliated with the, Achad Ha'am cultural Zionist school of thought that, no, if Jews are going to, return to an ancestral homeland and build a state, you need to revive the natural culture. It's not enough to just take a bunch of European Jews and plop them down in the Middle East. And so he starts this project of reviving Hebrew. And so just my favorite story is he had some children and he raised his kids, their first language being Hebrew. And they were at that point the only people in the world whose first language was Hebrew. And so I often imagine, I mean, Eliezer ben Yehuda was very ideological. You can read his writings and he believed very strongly in his project. But I mean, it's a fascinating thing to imagine, having your kids be the only people in the world who speak that language and, potentially not anything else. So talk to me about the revival of Hebrew. What was involved there? How hard was it? I mean, was it just as simple as saying, okay, well, we have thousands of years of Hebrew, it should be easy enough to concoct a language, or was it actually a lot more difficult than that?
So just to clarify the question, Daniel, when you say how hard was it, do you mean like linguistically how difficult was it, or socially how difficult was it? Because socially, of
Let's
course, those
let's
children were in anguish.
got it. Yeah, so let's talk about both. We'll hit socially afterwards. But linguistically, meaning, right, I believe that Hebrew is the only time in history where you have a language from that was a spoken language 3,000 years ago being revived. On the other hand, Hebrew is also a language that it's not really fair to say that nobody spoke Hebrew for 3,000 years, because anytime you enter into a synagogue and you pray, the morning prayer, you are speaking Hebrew. And so, there are, any educated Jew for the last 2,000 years would have known enough Hebrew to be passable in conversation. I actually believe I was looking at for a medieval class that I was teaching, when Jews went and did business with each other, right? So say you have a Jew from England doing business with a Jew from Portugal, right? The Jew from Portugal in the Middle Ages was speaking Arabic, and the Jew from England was speaking, I don't remember if English was invented yet or some, proto-English, and I'll use your word proto from before. So when they met, at least some historians posit that they were actually speaking a form of broken biblical Hebrew, because, why not, right? If I pray and I know the Torah and you pray and you know the Torah, I can, we would be able to have a conversation based off of that. So from one perspective, it seems crazy to take a language that hadn't been spoken in thousands of years and revive it. On the other hand, it seems like the pieces were all there. You just needed somebody to say, like, no, we're actually seriously going to do this. Let's do it.
So there's a cute story from Jonas Savar, whom I believe you also took a class with, who taught modern Hebrew at UCLA. And he said that when he first immigrated from Iraq to Israel, he didn't know a word of Hebrew. And he was 13 years old, and he only knew the word for one. He asked somebody for a tea, and then he said, "Oh, chai echad," because he thought chai would be this universal word that we understood across the Middle East, and he knew echad. And then they were like, "Ma? What did you say?" So again, there's this kind of like pigeon, broken biblical Hebrew that Jews can use to communicate somewhat, albeit in a kind of, you know, broken or incoherent manner. But yes, so um, I would say so. Biblical Hebrew to revive it as a spoken language is not necessarily the most difficult thing because first of all the grammar structures do exist, right? And the language had been in constant evolution since biblical times. We have, Mishnaic Hebrew, we have other types of rabbinical Hebrew, we have medieval Hebrew, as you mentioned. So they have all these basic vocabulary words that exist. And I guess the more common question people ask is, what about all these terms for technology or for new concepts that didn't exist in the biblical times that we need to derive now for the purposes of modern language? In that case, Eliezer ben Yehuda would simply resort to reviving old classes of words. And what I mean by old classes, so basically how nouns were formed in biblical Hebrew, he would look at the structure, or what linguists call morphology, the pattern of which nouns in which nouns were put, and then use that pattern and apply it to and apply it and to create new words. The best example, for instance, would be the word daleket. Appears in the book of Deuteronomy. It refers to some kind of inflammation, some kind of disease that we're not really sure. We just know it's not a thing you want to have. It's part of the curses for not obeying the mitzvot. Now, so the leket follows this pattern of da leket. And so what Eliezer ben Yehuda and later um, linguist of modern Hebrew did was say, okay, let's take this vowel pattern and apply it to existing roots. So for instance, if they were kelef, with your dog, as your dog will know the word kelef, let's take that root, kaf lamet vet, and let's put in that pattern. So we have kelevet, which people can guess means rabies because it's a disease you get from dogs. So again, there are these existing templates that were used, and their existence merely was already enough help. Another example is sometimes if Hebrew didn't have enough templates that were suitable, Eliezer ben Yehuda would look at Arabic. So, for instance, the word for in Arabic they add this iya ending. For instance, the word for city hall is so they take beled, which means city sometimes, and they add iya, so beladiya. And this is why in Hebrew it becomes iriyah from Irian. So again, Eliezer ben Yehuda was very creative in the way he would borrow these existing patterns from either ancient Hebrew or Cognate Semitic languages and really morph them into modern Hebrew words. So linguistically, it's clever. It's not an impossible task.
Hmm.
Socially, that's a different question
Yeah, no,
altogether.
socially is fascinating. And so I'll set the background and then, I'm sure you can explore this further than I can. There's something called the Milchamot Sefaot, right? I'll pull out my Hebrew, right? The battle or the war of the languages. And this is in, early, interwar period in British Mandate Palestine. You had these, competing schools or institutions, oftentimes publishing houses, one that was speaking, Yiddish and the other that was speaking, this sort of nascent modern Hebrew. And these groups, hated it. This wasn't just, okay, you like, I don't know, you want to have pizza for dinner and I want to have pasta, so maybe we'll go to different restaurants and meet in the middle, right? This was, a question that got to the fundamental roots of, the project of Zionism. At one point, I believe the some, hoodlums from the Hebrew speaking institution actually went and tried to firebomb one of the Yiddish publishing presses. The details here are a little bit murky in my head, but talk to us a little bit about the social ability, for lack of a better word, the sociology of trying to create this, new type of Hebrew in a really top down way from Eliezer ben Yehuda. And how do you actually go from one guy or one family speaking this to, now you go to Israel and, no one even thinks twice about how crazy it is that everybody's speaking this language that was sort of created by this, fascinating, crazy thinker in the early 1900s.
That's one of the interesting gaps in our knowledge, right? Or at least in my knowledge, in that we know that Eliezer ben Yehuda started this movement, and then we wonder, oh, 150 years later, here it is super successful, right? So what are some of the factors at stake here? What happened? What changed so much? And I would think like anything, it's probably not an overnight change. We have multiple aliyot that started in the 1800s, right? And we have Jews coming in from different countries. And when I first started studying Jewish history, I assumed that most of them came from Europe. But it turns out that we actually had a good number of Ladino-speaking Jews or Judeo-Arabic speaking Jews that migrated in from different countries. And at that point, Yiddish would no longer seem to be the logical lingua franca or the common language for all these people. And also, there's this idea in Zionism where where Jews are trying to distance themselves from the galus, so what they refer to as the exile. What is the exilic Jew? The exilic Jew is weak. The exilic Jew is a minority. The exilic Jew speaks the language of the majority in a Hebrew in a somewhat Hebraic form. So Yiddish became viewed as this language of the galus, the language of the exiles, no longer suitable to be a language for a thriving, fledgling Jewish state. And so I think there's this idea of Zionist ideology uh, evolving and realizing the need for Hebrew as a way to unite Jews from the diaspora, as well as a way to kind of separate themselves from this exilic identity that Jews had had for the last 2,000 years. So that's kind of and of course, other individual level, other families saw Eliezer ben Yehuda succeed. I mean, he did this massive experiment where his son was not able to speak till 4, and then he had no friends and he was miserable. But then other families start to be inspired by the fact that, oh, a child could learn to speak Hebrew, and there's always this veneration of Hebrew that Jews have. And so I think it's just a matter of the right circumstances and the changes in ideology, and coupled with the differences within the Jewish community and the need to unite them, that really led to modern Hebrew being the logical option. And I know some people really deplore the fact that Yiddish is no longer used, or Ladino, and all these other Jewish languages are the brink of extinction. Maybe Yiddish less so, but especially the other ones. But I think there was this necessity for the Jewish community, if they want, to establish themselves as one people, they needed to have a language that really doesn't show favoritism to a particular group. Now, of course, in modern Hebrew, you can make the argument that modern Hebrew pronunciation has been kind of reformed or redefined in a way that does betray the Ashkenazi origins or the Ashkenazi dominance of the early Zionist movement. But it still serves as this kind of common language that is relatively neutral and relatively well understood.
Yeah, no, and the sort of reinvention of the Jewish stereotype by Zionists is probably one of the most interesting chapters of Jewish history. For those interested, I did a whole series on Zionism, so you can see that. And Hebrew really was at the forefront, and exactly as you said it. But I just wanted to highlight because it's so much stronger. I don't necessarily think this was front of mind of Ben Yehuda and others when inventing Hebrew, but if Israel truly wanted to be the state that it ended up becoming, which is, the sort of the Jewish state for Jews all over the world, and today, of course, the Jewish population in Israel is over 50% non-Ashkenazi Jews, you basically had to give up on Yiddish. I mean, Yiddish was so connected to the Ashkenazi diaspora slash exile. And in a way, I mean, it's funny, I'll speak personally for a second. For years, my grandparents spoke Yiddish, as most Ashkenazi Jews' grandparents spoke Yiddish. I mean, if you were around in obviously Europe, but even if you were around in New York in the first half of the 1900s, I mean, Yiddish was everywhere in the Jewish community. People were expected to know Yiddish, to read Yiddish. Newspapers. Today we have the Jewish Journal or whatever that's written in English. The 1920s version of the Jewish Journal was written in Yiddish, and most Jews were expected to learn it. But I grew up without any sense of the importance of Yiddish. I mean, I really was taught, I went to Jewish day school, Ashkenazi Jewish day schools my whole life. And we were taught Hebrew from the time I was in preschool. And there was never any attempt for anyone to teach us Yiddish. And it was kind of assumed that this is a dead language. I would say in the last couple of years, I've become a little bit reinterested in not learning Yiddish because I'm terrible with learning languages to begin with, but at least understanding the cultural importance of Yiddish. But it's so clear that Hebrew won in this debate in such major ways that I think if you went back 100 years ago and you sort of told somebody that there would be, I mean, what are there, probably 10 to 15 million fluent Hebrew speakers in the world today, maybe even more, I think they'd be shocked. I mean, it's just such an interesting evolution of a story. I know we're nearing our end time here, so I have a couple of just rapid fire questions at you, and then if there's any other topic you think is interesting, we can go for a few more minutes. When you're in Israel, and you order food or something like that in Hebrew? I mean, what are some of the reactions that you get? You obviously, not to overly stereotype, but if I saw you on the streets of Tel Aviv, I would not assume I should talk to you in Hebrew.
So there's a few reactions, right? Number one, which is probably the least common, they just speak back to me in Hebrew, as if nothing had happened, and there's not. And sometimes it surprises me, though. There's no comment. Not that I want to get too much attention, but I'm just so used to attracting attention of all sorts. This one is a more common one. They speak to me in English. So acting like they didn't hear the question in Hebrew, which I used to take offense at, and actually that actually made me so sensitive when learning foreign languages. If somebody speaks to me in English when I speak to them in the target language, I almost get taken aback. But in Israel, it's really the case when they don't think your Hebrew is good enough, they speak to you in English,
Well, the
right?
problem, I mean, not to defend the sort of social stereotyping, but the the funny thing, because I take a lot of American Jews to Israel, and everybody knows the word shalom, right? So I'll have all these Jewish students try to order, a falafel, and they'll say shalom, and then the guy will talk back to them in Hebrew, and then they'll immediately resort back to English because their Hebrew doesn't go further than shalom. So perhaps that's the ongoing assumption. Still to this day, I always try to do everything in Hebrew when I'm in Israel, and very quickly they resort to English after about 2 minutes.
Right, and sometimes even if there's a more aggressive way that they resort to English. For instance, one time I was at a hotel and they simply didn't have patience for me. Even though I was speaking, I thought my Hebrew at this point, I mean, this was last year actually, so my Hebrew at this point is likely better than their English. But then they were speaking, I asked them, oh, yesh sabon, like, do you have soap? And they said, oh, speak to me in English. I understand, is what they told me. I was like, whoa, that is, that was one of the more aggressive ways that they kind of resorted back to English. And so I said, it's not worth this linguistic battle with them. So I just spoke English in that case, if they want to insist on speaking English. Then, of course, people are pleasantly surprised and they ask you where you learned it. But then at some point, I start to get tired of having the answers in English. It's like a T-shirt that explains it. Or here, take my card. And it explains it all. So I have to tell you the same story over and over again.
Yeah, no, I mean, I remember at UCLA, just to give listeners a little bit of background, I mean, you at some point became the face of Hebrew studies at UCLA. I mean, it was fascinating because, obviously we had a couple of Hebrew professors, but I believe you were the only grad student doing a PhD in Hebrew for years. And you were the TA for all the Hebrew speaking classes, and you taught, your sort of own classes. You would come to Hillel and, sit there, and, it was always, I remember trying to practice my Hebrew with you, years ago in undergrad. So it's a great story. I mean, what about students? I mean, when people sign up for your classes, are they ever, I mean, how often, I guess, how often do you feel that you have to explain yourself? How interested are you in that versus, let's just get to the Hebrew, the same way that they would if they were taking a Hebrew class with someone named, David Shapiro?
Right. So you said a couple of times I was so nervous the day before class would start. I wouldn't even be able to sleep because I was so nervous. I was showing my face the next day. So this was particularly acute when I taught as a lecturer at the university at Washington University in St. Louis, and there's a large Jewish community there. Actually, around 30% of the students are Jewish, and so we had this thriving Hebrew program, and 99% of the students were Jewish. And then the very first day I stepped in there and met the students, I was terrified, Daniel. I thought, like, my God, you must not make a mistake. You must not slip up into English. You must not have too heavy an accent because you're going to be judged very harshly. So there's this, kind of fear that does drive me to be better. And actually, I would say that having taught Hebrew at that university, that experience was formative in becoming even better at Hebrew because I felt I had this constant need to prove myself and to be better than an Israeli or to be better than a native speaker because I had to show you, you can get something from me that you can't get from somebody else, but I have to prove it. And now at Kentucky, I don't deal with that as much because most of my students are not Jewish. And then so in fact, I think it's a little bit more comfortable for me personally, just because I don't have to confront um this audience who doesn't know who I am and prove myself to them. And I think the students also feel a bit more comfortable learning Hebrew because they see this kind of non-typical Hebrew teacher profile in front of them. And that kind of relaxes them and also conveys the message that Hebrew really is for everybody to learn, and you don't have to be Jewish, and you don't have to know Hebrew previously before coming to this class. And so I hope that my presence is actually reassuring.
No, I'm sure it does. And it's funny, I'm preparing right now for a class I'm teaching in the fall at UCI on ancient texts, but really we're going to be talking about a lot of biblical narratives and a whole the multiplicity of interpretation. And one of the great statistics that any book about biblical interpretation opens up with the same epithet, the Bible is the most read book of all time. I mean, which is true, right? If you think about which book has been read both currently probably in the world and also just across history, the Bible wins by, maybe a magnitude of 5, maybe the Quran is, slowly catching up, but really it's the Bible, is still in first by a long shot. And to think such a small percentage of the world right now can actually understand it in the original is really interesting to think about. I mean, for every person who studies the Bible weekly, maybe 0.1% of people actually know it in Hebrew, which is really interesting. I mean, it's a fascinating, you know, I don't know about commentary or anything like that, but it is really interesting to think about it there. You had mentioned University of Kentucky, and just listeners on my podcast are also tend to be very interested in wider Jewish happenings around the world. Obviously, campus very much shifted, for this past year after October 7th, and anybody on really any campus across the country was dealing with the sort of wider campus backlash. What was the experience? Both, you can talk generally about University of Kentucky. Did this come into, I mean, obviously Hebrew is the language of the Jewish state that was at the center of so much, discussion. Did this ever get to a point where any Hebrew classes were potentially going to be canceled, or there was any protesting? You can take that question however you want.
Okay, so that's a really good question. So actually, the University of Kentucky, it's been pretty non-sectarian and pretty apolitical. I mean, relatively speaking. We did have some minor protests toward the end of the spring semester during finals week, but at this point, most people had already dispersed. So, regarding Hebrew classes, our primary demographic at the University of Kentucky actually is not the Jewish community, simply because of the numbers. According to Hillel.org, there are around 300 Jewish students at the University of Kentucky, and that is probably an overestimate. So we realized that in order to achieve the survival of Hebrew, we would need to pivot and to include a wider audience. And again, as you said, billions of people have read the Hebrew Bible in translation. How and yet such a small percentage of people actually know the original language. So by pivoting toward biblical Hebrew and telling them that an ingress for you to understand the original language, and then for Jewish students, you can also switch to modern Hebrew afterwards, and I could facilitate that. We've actually changed the nature of the program. So the program has become more biblical Hebrew focused, just because of necessity based on where we are. And that's the benefit of that is that it also arouses a little bit less attention as far as teaching a quote unquote Zionist language, right? So we wouldn't get we didn't get boycotted. This wasn't the plan, but this was just a happy byproduct of what we're doing at the University of Kentucky. That's the first bit. The second bit is a greater issue that we're trying to navigate right now, is that people simply don't know that Jewish studies exists at the University of Kentucky. When I applied for this job, I was shocked to see University of Kentucky offering Hebrew and Jewish studies. I couldn't believe it. I didn't even know if I should have. I didn't even know what this was. I was I came in California, and so I applied for jobs in New York. I even applied for a job in Vanderbilt in Tennessee, but that's a bit major university. And University of Kentucky, a state school in the South, we didn't expect to have Hebrew and Jewish studies, and most people don't know we exist. And so, in a way, that's not great for our visibility, and we're trying to advertise and grow our visibility on campus. But during this very sensitive period of time, it does protect us to be kind of shrouded in mystery or obscurity.
Yeah, I mean, I have noticed, I mean, just because Jews and Judaism, I mean, are just in the news at such a disproportionate level. I mean, really always, but especially this past year, I would imagine. I mean, at least at UCI, I know that's resulted in an uptick of people wanting to take Jewish studies classes. Of course, Jewish students, yes, but also non-Jewish students that just, I mean, even in my, I was teaching medieval Jewish thought last spring at UC Irvine, and I went and I always try to ask the students, what brought you into this class? And there were 50 students in the class, and a couple students told me in office hours, because of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I was interested in learning more about Judaism. It doesn't mean they wanted to convert. It doesn't mean they, and I was thinking in my head, I don't know how learning about Sajagon is going to really, enhance their understanding about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I think a lot of people are just, I want to learn something about this because I don't know anything about it. I'm curious. I mean, did that have sort of the same effect, or?
That's a really good question. So I didn't poll all my students last year why and ask them why they were taking Hebrew and Jewish studies with me, but I suspect that it did not really feature in their consciousness. Because at the University of Kentucky, the university has strived to be as apolitical as possible, and many of these students come from backgrounds where they're not really engrossed in what's going on in the world. Right? We're barely keeping up with what's going on in the state. And we have, as a state, I mean, Kentucky is a great place to live, but as a state, we have a lot of issues that we're dealing with, right? These students come from these backgrounds where it's challenging. So I think that because they don't have the luxury of, of being able to think about world problems, their view of Hebrew and Jewish studies is not necessarily informed by current politics. It's more informed by what they know. In this case, they know Christianity, they know the Bible, and that's what brings them to our classes primarily.
Got it. That's fascinating. Okay, so we've been talking for a long time. Any other topics, things from history, things about Hebrew that you would be upset with me if we don't address?
Oh my goodness, I think we covered so much. We covered biblical Hebrew, we covered modern Hebrew. Um, I think if we covered the current politics at the University of Kentucky. All I want to say is that as far as people were asking, are there Jews in Kentucky? There absolutely are Jews in Kentucky. And then I told you this earlier, Daniel, but Kentucky has had a long presence of Jewish life for better and for worse. So actually, General Ulysses S. Grant gave an eviction order to the Jews of Paducah, Kentucky during the Civil War. An order was later rescinded by Lincoln, and this marks the only time when Jews were expelled in the continental U.S. So Jews have been here in Kentucky for hundreds of years, and Jews are here to stay. And there's a healthy, growing community, around 12,000 Jews in the whole state. And so people should come visit this beautiful state. And we have Chabads in Louisville and Lexington, and there are Jewish studies programs in different universities of the state. So don't forget about the other states, and don't just focus on California and New York and Florida. Jews are everywhere, and Jewish studies is everywhere.
Amazing. So next time I'm in Kentucky, I will definitely have to come visit. Martin Luther
Absolutely.
King, thank you so much
Absolutely.
for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Daniel, for having me. This was great.